Welcome to Understand All. I'm your host, Aslakir Gerleaf. Today, we're embarking on a fascinating journey through the history of Mitzvot, the commandments that form the foundation of Jewish life. So let's dive right in. Have you ever wondered why some Jewish people won't flip a light switch on Saturdays? It all comes down to the Mitzvot. These commandments, 613 in total, guide every aspect of Jewish life, from the sacred to the mundane. But where did they come from? How have they evolved over time? And what do they mean for Jews today? Let's start at the very beginning, with the origins of the Mitzvot. The Torah, the central text of Judaism, is the primary source of these commandments. In fact, the word mitzvah itself comes from the Hebrew root meaning to command. The Torah contains 613 mitzvot, according to the Talmud, the compilation of Jewish oral law. But get this. The Talmud also tells us that these 613 commandments are divided into 248 positive commandments and 365 negative commandments. Why those numbers? Well, the rabbis say that the 248 positive commandments correspond to the number of bones and significant organs in the human body, while the 365 negative commandments match the number of days in a solar year. Pretty cool, right? But the Torah is just the beginning. The mitzvot have been interpreted, debated, and expanded upon for thousands of years. In the time of the Second Temple, from 516 BCE to 70 CE, different Jewish sects had their own takes on the commandments. The Pharisees, for example, believed in a more flexible interpretation, while the Sadducees stuck to a literal reading of the Torah. And then there were the Essenes, who took the mitzvot to a whole new level with their ascetic lifestyle. Can you imagine living in a desert commune, spending your days in prayer and ritual purity? It's a far cry from flipping light switches. Fast forward a few centuries, and we have the Mishnah and the Talmud, the written compilations of Jewish oral law. These texts are filled with debates about the mitzvot. How do you properly observe the Sabbath? What makes a food kosher? When is it okay to break a commandment to save a life? The rabbis argued about these questions for generations, and their discussions form the basis of Jewish law to this day. But here's where it gets really interesting. In the Middle Ages, a scholar named Maimonides came along and did something revolutionary. He codified the 613 mitzvot, organizing them into a systematic list. Maimonides' work, known as the Mishneh Torah, became the gold standard for Jewish law. But not everyone agreed with his classifications. Other scholars, like Nachmanides, had their own ideas about which commandments belonged where. It just goes to show that even with a clear list, there's always room for interpretation. Now let's take a closer look at some of the key mitzvot. First up, Shabbat. The commandment to rest on the seventh day is perhaps the most well-known of all the mitzvot. But did you know that the Torah mentions Shabbat a whopping 12 times? That's right, this mitzvah is a big deal. And it's not just about taking a day off. The rabbis saw Shabbat as a taste of the world to come, a time when all of creation would be in harmony. By refraining from work and focusing on the spiritual, Jews get a glimpse of that perfect future. Next, let's talk about kashrut, the Jewish dietary laws. The Torah lays out which animals are kosher and which aren't, but it's not always so simple. Take the famous split hoof and chews its cud rule. Sounds straightforward, but what about the camel? It chews its cud but doesn't have a split hoof. Or the pig, which has a split hoof but doesn't chew its cud. The rabbis had to figure out how to apply these rules in the real world, and their decisions have shaped Jewish cuisine for centuries. But the mitzvot aren't just about ritual observance. They also encompass ethical behavior and social justice. Take the commandment to love your neighbor as yourself, found in Leviticus 19:18. It's a simple idea, but it has profound implications. How do we treat the stranger, the widow, the orphan? How do we ensure that everyone in our community is cared for? The mitzvot challenge us to put our values into action, to create a society based on compassion and kindness. Of course, the mitzvot have also been a source of controversy and conflict over the centuries. In the 8th century, a group known as the Karaites rejected the authority of the Talmud and the rabbis, insisting on a literal interpretation of the Torah. The Karaites saw themselves as the true keepers of the mitzvot, but the mainstream Jewish community viewed them as heretics. The debate between the Karaites and the Rabbinites, as the mainstream Jews came to be known, would continue for centuries, shaping the course of Jewish history. And then there's the question of how to observe the mitzvot in the modern world. With the rise of the Haskalah, or Jewish Enlightenment, in the 18th century, some Jews began to question the relevance of the commandments in a changing society. The Reform movement, which emerged in Germany in the early 19th century, sought to adapt Judaism to the modern world, emphasizing ethics over ritual. but the Orthodox movement pushed back, insisting on the eternal validity of the mitzvot. And in between these two poles, the conservative movement sought a middle ground, balancing tradition and change. Today, the debate over the mitzvot continues. How do we apply ancient laws to contemporary situations? What does it mean to keep kosher in a globalized food system? How do we observe Shabbat in a 24/7 digital age? These are the questions that Jews grapple with every day as they seek to live a life guided by the mitzvot. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of the mitzvot is the way they've been interpreted and reinterpreted over the centuries. Take the famous Talmudic story of the oven of Achnai. The rabbis were debating whether a certain type of oven was kosher or not, and they couldn't come to a consensus. Finally, one rabbi, Eliezer, insisted that he was right, and he called upon God to prove it. According to the story, a heavenly voice proclaimed that Eliezer was correct, but the other rabbis refused to accept this divine intervention. They argued that the Torah was not in heaven, but had been given to humans to interpret. In the end, the majority ruled against Eliezer, and his oven was declared non-kosher. This story is often seen as a triumph of human reason over divine authority, but it's also a testament to the incredible flexibility and adaptability of the mitzvot. The rabbis understood that the commandments were not static, but living and breathing, subject to interpretation and debate. They saw themselves not as passive recipients of divine law, but as active participants in the ongoing process of revelation. And that ultimately is the power of the mitzvot. They connect us to a tradition that stretches back thousands of years, a chain of learning and practice that links us to our ancestors and to Jews around the world. But they also challenge us to make that tradition our own, to grapple with it, to question it, to find our own way of living a meaningful and ethical life. So the next time you see a Jew wearing a kippah or lighting Shabbat candles, remember the incredible history and complexity behind those simple acts. The mitzvot are not just a set of rules, but a living conversation, a dance between the human and the divine, the ancient and the modern, the particular and the universal. And that conversation is far from over. As Rabbi Tarfon put it in the Mishnah, it is not your responsibility to finish the work, but neither are you free to desist from it. The mitzvot are a never-ending project, a challenge and an invitation to every generation of Jews. So let me leave you with a question. What does it mean to you to live a life guided by the mitzvot? How do you balance tradition and change, obligation and innovation, the demands of the past and the needs of the present? These are the questions that Jews have been asking for centuries, and they're the questions that we'll continue to ask as we move forward into an uncertain future. But one thing is certain, the mitzvot will be there to guide us, to challenge us, to inspire us, as they have for generations. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the history and meaning of the mitzvot. I hope you've learned something new, and I hope you'll keep learning, keep questioning, keep engaging with this incredible tradition. Until next time, this is Aslakir Gerleaf for Understand All. Keep exploring, keep wondering, and keep living a life of purpose and meaning. Shalom!